say everything is, the big brother is watching and listening to all of us. Okay, today we're going to finish off the discussion of the theory of demand, which is in your chapter 9 book. Covers some further or final concluding implications of some implications of the theory of demand theory. And this pertains to mostly three main points. Try to manipulate the camera a little bit. And I recall that once upon a time when I was very young, I was considering studying for a movie director. I know how wise I was not to even try. Okay, so three things that we're going to be talking about today. Some of them we already kind of hinted at or mentioned, but now we're going to discuss them a little bit more. The concept of relative prices versus monetary prices. The second one is one thing that could be called the third law of demand, or alternatively, Alchian-Allen effect, or Alchian-Allen theorem. If you haven't noticed, Alchian and Allen, two guys here, those are your textbook authors. They are responsible for the formulation of this third law of demand, and I'll explain in detail what this so-called third law of demand means. It has to do with relative prices, but you remember the first law, relative prices versus monetary prices. What's the difference? And the role of relative prices in explaining the concept of demand. That you cannot understand the concepts of demand by concepts of demand and related concepts such as scarcity. You know, you remember this. Demand versus needs means that the need is a demand that has to take into account sacrifices that you have to make in order to acquire something. Or scarcity. Okay, so you'll see that the role of relative prices in all that. Then the third law of demand, the first one being inverse relationship between the price and quantity, the second one being about the elasticity of demand and the time period, the third one, we'll see what is that. And finally, we will comment briefly on some alleged exceptions to the first law of demand. First law of demand. Exceptions, so-called exceptions, you will see why. These are the type of situations in which it seems like the demand curve is sloping upwards. It seems as if higher price of a product leads to higher quantity demanded on the market, which seems to contradict the basic first law of demand. And we will see why in all cases this is a misconception stemming from confusing certain things pertaining to the theory of demand. So we'll come back to that. Okay, so these three things, kind of interrelated three things, are the final concluding remarks or final concluding concepts that we will say something about today. We have some of the examples when we start with the first one, relative prices. Is this my computer or yours? No, it's not. No. So relative prices versus monetary prices. The dogma that you have to remember about relative prices and monetary prices is that scarcity of goods is not determined by monetary prices. You cannot learn anything about the demand for a given good, about the strength of this demand, about its relative scarcity just by looking at its monetary price. Can you see that? Can you hear that?
Yeah, I can hear it.
So what is
It's
that?
the sirens outside.
Oh, sirens.
It happens on your drive.
For a moment, I started panicking that I have some auditive hallucinations, that I'm hearing voices. Okay, I feel better now. Yeah. I'm not crazy. Yeah, good to know. Good to get confirmation from time to time that you are on the right side. Okay. So what was I talking about?
Relative pressure.
Relative pressure. Once you start getting older, I mean, two things start happening. First, your hearing starts to go slowly. I don't remember what the second one was. I stole that joke from a guy who's much older than me. I figured it made a good time to start trading in such jokes because they're not really jokes. Past 40 or already that domain. So monetary prices, the dogma is that monetary prices are not relevant at all for assessing how scarce something is. So the fact that a cup of coffee costs you $3 doesn't tell you a thing about how scarce coffee is. Why is that the case? A cup of coffee could have been $500. When I was young, when I was of your age, a cup of coffee in my country costed like 2 trillion dinars. Dinar was a currency in my country. That didn't mean that the cup of coffee was more valuable than the entire GDP of North Dakota at that time. It only meant that the government inflated the money supply and that the prices were, in nominal terms, extraordinarily high. So what matters for assessing how scarce something is what is that? How do we know that something is scarce? When you say, oh, this laptop is too expensive for me. What do you mean by that? Do you mean that the number of dollars that you have to pay is high? Of course, in a certain sense you say, but in economic sense, what do you mean by that? Something is too expensive, or something is dirt cheap.
You're looking at a relationship between what is the value of it and not just what you're willing to pay, but like, I think the idea is like, is a value.
Yeah, I'll put the term is what is the value for you, the value of an additional cup of coffee for you. Your perspective, okay? All well and good, all correct, but not quite precise. What does that mean? Your perspective. Why the value of a cup of coffee is not the same for all people? Now you're going to tell me that different people value coffee differently. Okay, but what does that mean?
Well, some people think that their money would be better spent somewhere else.
Okay, excellent. What does that mean for them?
Marginal utility.
Yeah, okay, marginal utility. Their money could be better spent elsewhere. So that means that different people have a different evaluations of relative value of coffee and other things. So when you say that cup of coffee is very cheap, what you really want to say that on your value scale, you don't have to sacrifice too much of other valuable things in order to get one additional cup of coffee. That's it. Something is cheap, or the characterization of a good as cheap or expensive, scarce or abundant is dependent on its relationship to other things on your own value scale. So that's a kind of general point. Demand for a certain thing is dependent on the evaluations that you have, not only of that thing, but of all other things. Like an evaluation of one single thing in isolation from everything else is meaningless. That's not an evaluation, you know. It's always a relationship between how you value this thing versus all other things. Why? Because of scarcity. You have limited resources and you have, for example, limited amount of dollars. In order to spend $3 additional on a cup of coffee, you have to reduce your purchases on something else. So now, how is that related, this basic concept is related to relative prices. So what are relative prices? Relative prices are just exchange ratios between different things. Relative prices, exchange ratios. So that means a cup of coffee is $3. A new laptop is $240. Let's say a loaf of bread is $6. Let's say a cart of milk is $3 as well. In order to make it mathematically simpler, I'm going to use it. So now, let's imagine this is our economy, that you're spending all of your money on these goods. So now, what is the structure of relative prices in this economy? Can you tell? No. This is not a preference list. This is just a list of market prices for goods. You can switch them whichever way you want. It doesn't matter that coffee is written here first. It doesn't mean that you like coffee the most. It's not your value scale. It's just the structure of market prices. These are the prices if you want to buy something that you have to pay on the market. $3 for a cup of coffee, $200 for a laptop, $6 for a loaf of bread, $3 for a cart of milk. So what is the structure of relative prices? Exchange ratios between the units of all of these goods. Is 3 to 240 to 6 to 3, or 1 to 120 to 2 to 1. That's the really important thing that you want to know about the economy. Structure of relative prices is a mathematical ratio of monetary prices of different goods. Relative prices, which means the price of one thing expressed in another good, in the price of another. So one laptop is worth 120. Oh no, I'm sorry. It's 80, of course. It's 80 to 1. So one new laptop is worth 80 cups of coffee on the market. That's the relative price of coffee and laptops. What is the relative price of bread and laptops?
40 to 1?
Yeah, 40 to 1. So that's important. So it doesn't matter. You can write down here 3 million and 24 million, 240 million, 6 million and 3 million. The ratio will be the same. So no one individual price has any information value for you with regard to the relative scarcity of a good. What tells you something about the relative scarcity of a good is its exchange ratio of its monetary price to the monetary price of something else that you also want to buy. So for how scarce resources are going to be allocated among alternative use, what is really important is to discover the structure of relative prices in the economy. So now you can imagine an infinitely more complicated array of prices in the structure of the economy, with thousands of different goods being traded every day, and you have a relative prices. So nobody knows the structure of relative prices at any one given point in time. We don't need to know it. We only have to know the monetary prices. But the relative structure of prices remains all the time, depending on how much people decide to buy and sell. So that's one basic point to remember all the time, that the real price or real prices that determine scarcity and the demand, how strong the demand for something will be, is the exchange ratios between that one thing that you study and all other things that you also want to acquire. The second thing pertaining to the theory of demand, one more implication that is spelled out in your book, is something we already touched upon. I want just to amplify. Now, we know that demand doesn't equal need, and the demand for something or effective demand for something is a need that takes into account scarcity. That's how much people decide to spend on something, not how much in an ideal world people would have spent on something. So, the joke that I might mention to you, like the two economists passing by the Ferrari dealership, and one of them says, oh, I would really like to have this car. His colleague says, obviously not. Because if you really demanded that car, actually you would have redistributed your other resources, you would have bought it. The fact that you refrained from even trying to buy it says to me that your need for a Ferrari car is not strong enough to make you the demander of Ferrari cars. Why this economist couldn't be a demander of Ferrari cars? Because he's a professor of economics, not the CEO of a successful company, and professors of economics usually don't earn enough money to buy Ferraris. And what do I mean when I say professors of economics usually don't earn enough money to buy Ferraris? Is that literally true? Why yes and why not?
Preferences.
Yeah, preferences. Can you imagine a situation in which a professor of economics would buy a Ferrari? Yeah.
To save all the money, basically.
To save all the money, to steal some money, to sell their children to pirates, to go into debt, to try and gamble, to do all kinds of things. But obviously 99.9% of professors of economics do not consider these other things that they have to do worth new Ferrari. So yeah, preferences are the key. They prefer going without Ferrari cars, doing all other things that they need to do. They need some training in narco dealing business in order to acquire enough money, and they need to take at least 1 year without pay for this. So they are not ready to pay the price for that. So everything has a price, believe it or not. Everything could be achieved at a price. There's one economist.
What about happiness?
Oh, what about happiness? Yeah. Can you buy happiness? And in what sense?
Never seen anyone frowning on a jet ski.
Okay. So what does it mean to say that somebody is buying happiness? Yeah, the most obvious way is like
they get things that make them happy.
They get things that make them happy. Okay, so these things could be. Go ahead, somebody, Casey.
Well, it's only for like a short amount of time.
Sorry,
It's only for a short amount of time.
It's only for a short amount of time if, in any cases whatsoever. So you're a true Buddhist, actually. Buddhists believe that, forget about it, actually. The desire is the source of all suffering. The way to be happy in this world is to eliminate, to understand that the desire is the source of evil. So get over it. Even if you cannot suppress your desires, you have to understand that this is the source of evil. You have to live with full understanding every waking hour that you are never going to be happy, and it's okay. So, but if you're not a Buddhist or not good enough Buddhist, then you're always buying happiness in a certain way by buying stuff that makes you happy. Wealthy men and women buy Versace dresses or Ferrari cars. The rest of us are buying happiness, sometimes with money, sometimes by sacrificing certain things to achieve other things. It's always buying happiness. By buying happiness, actually, you're trying to achieve certain things, monetary or non-monetary, by sacrificing other things. So don't look upon people who are buying monetary material stuff with money in order to make them happy. You are doing the same thing in a non-monetary fashion. There is nothing particularly noble about buying happiness without money. It's exactly the same thing. Money is just a medium of exchange. We all make exchanges all the time. When you're making sacrifices to accommodate your friend, you're buying happiness. You're sacrificing doing something else in order to spend 1 hour or 2 hours with your friend or a boyfriend or a girlfriend or family or whatever. You're bribing them to give you something in exchange. Yeah, of course. You're paying them. You're paying them to give you something in exchange. Or at least you are paying. You're sacrificing something. So you see, there is nothing particularly ignoble about monetary exchange and nothing particularly noble about non-monetary exchanges. Everything is an exchange always, either with yourself or with other people. Even if you're a saint, you're making an exchange with yourself. You're exchanging your despicable existence of not devoting 100% of your energy to saving the souls of other people for a state of affairs in which you could do that. You're buying your happiness by relinquishing the worldly ambitions for the life of sainthood. You're buying happiness. Okay, so it's a long way from. And by the way, it is a long way from our discussion, but it is not in another one. Relative prices are different. So relative prices of spiritual strivings versus material satisfaction in general in people are different. Saints have a relative price of spiritual striving, which is much higher than for many other people. In order to sacrifice 1 unit of spiritual striving, the exchange ratio in material goods that has to be, or in some other conflicting goal has to be really high. For example, if you don't stop doing that, the world is going to come to an end. People will suffer. Even the saint will say, okay, I'll settle for a more materialistic life because the costs of my pursuing the career of a saint is too high. So everything has a price. There is one economist says who was peddling the stories like this to his students in the similar way I'm doing right now, and one smart kid asked, "Would you sell me your kids if everything has a price and everything is just exchange ratio?" He answered, "Maybe, I don't know. Give me an offer. I will see. Give me an offer." So if an offer was, imagine for a month, so you would never sell your kids, or you would never consider a situation in which you would be ready to sacrifice the lives of your kids. What if the alternative was that the entire world is going to come to an end? Who knows? So that's the meaning of that everything has a price. Just the prices of certain things are higher, prices of other things are lower. This is the structure of our world. Relative prices are the structure of our life. Everything that we do conforms to the same principle, the same law. It's just that the numbers are different. And we have the illusion that the structure is not the same because the numbers are so different in different realms of our existence. Okay, going back from this philosophical excursus. Sometimes we hear that the demand is too high for something. Let's say there is a shortage of water in California because the demand is too high. Or there is not enough scarcity of certain thing or other because the demand for that particular thing is too high. And in your book, you have a couple of examples of why this logic doesn't work. Actually, this is not correct. For example, there is a congestion on highways. And the explanation for this, usually, what is the explanation? So the highways are congested, the roads are congested.
Car accident?
No. Normal traffic, but just there is
Population.
increased population, increased demand, too many people with cars. So we have to do something. Either we're going to reduce the number of cars and to force people to take trains or public transportation, or to build new highways, new roads, and so on to accommodate higher demand. In California, they use 70%, 80% of water supply for irrigation, agriculture. Oh, it's a problem. We have to do something. We have to increase our capacity for physical water. What is that? Plants, water factories, or whatever capacities to process water in order to satisfy this higher demand. In Canada, for example, high demand for healthcare services. So there are wait lists. Canada, if you need to do a hip replacement, you have to wait 6 months. Too high demand. Now, what is the problem with this blaming of the demand, high demand, for relative scarcity or shortage of services or products? What all these cases have in common? Water supply in drought-stricken California, congested roads in big cities. So we people from the prairies have difficulty of adjusting to the metropolitan life. From time to time, when I visit my sister in Montreal, Canada, huge city, sometimes I would drive with her, with my brother-in-law from their work to place where they live, and in a rush hour, it's really like an hour and a half to pass 10 miles. How come that there is no such a rush and such a problem in less populated areas, or in some other areas that are populated, but they're organized in a different way? Why in New York, for example, well, another example from your book, they waste approximately, it's assessed that about 10% of the water supply is lost because of pipe leakages. Whereas in California, they're extremely economical about preserving their water, and still they don't have enough. So the main problem is actually, what is the problem? What do you think? Road congestion, not enough water, not enough healthcare services, has to be postponed as healthcare service in Canada. I had once, just an anecdote to show you how bad this is. In Canada, any Canadians here? Nobody. So if you've ever been to Canada, you know, for example, emergency room or walk-in clinics visits. If you're not really dying or something, if it's not a real life-threatening emergency, you can wait for 5, 6, 7 hours to be admitted. How it typically works, actually, you come to a walk-in clinic in the morning, early in the morning, and there is already a queue, like 10, 15 yards. They open the office, you enter, you sign up, and they tell you approximately, taking into account the average stay of a patient, when it will be your turn. So if you come at 9 o'clock, you sign up, and they tell you approximately 4:30 in the afternoon, a doctor will be able to see. Then you come at 5:30, and they tell you, okay, there was some problem, it's 5:54 or something like that. And then I used to live in Canada for 6 or 7 years, and I know everything about how that works. And then I came here. My first year, I had some eye infection, and I went to walk-in clinic downtown downtown mall in Bismarck. What is it? Not Gateway Mall, but the other one. Kirkland Mall, yeah, walking clinic. And there is a plaque, if you've ever been there, there is a waiting room, and there is a plaque that says, if you wait more than 10 minutes, please notify our personnel. And I took a picture of that and sent it to 5 or 6 of my Canadians. Now, how come that such a plaque exists in a waiting room in a walking clinic in Bismarck, North Dakota, but never people would have thought that was a joke if in Vancouver, Canada, or Montreal such a plaque, because everybody accepts that you have to wait 6 or 7 hours. How come that the demand for healthcare services in walking clinics is so much, apparently or seemingly, so much lower in America than in Canada? What is different?
How we pay for it?
Yeah, so how we pay, how they pay, how we pay. What is the difference? So the difference is how the price system works, or whether the price system works. So shortages or artificial scarcity results when you have a scarce economic good that needs to be rationed to prices. Which means the consumption has to be limited to prices, and you don't allow the price mechanism to work. You make something that is an economic good artificially on paper, in law, a free good. So water in California is extremely cheap, so that's why people use it for agriculture so large. If you put the higher prices on water, consumption for agricultural purposes would have gone down. Healthcare in Canada is free, so you don't pay anything. You go to an emergency room, you go to a walking clinic. If you have a card, which is a kind of a healthcare ID, every Canadian permanent resident and citizen has an ID. I think I have mine still with me. All services, all essential services, so apart from dental services of dentists and eyeglasses and cosmetic surgery and stuff like that, like most of the medical services are free. You don't pay anything. So now what can you predict about by looking at the demand curve? If you make a price of something dirt cheap, like a very low price, almost practically free, quantity demanded will skyrocket. So that's the reason. I'm not saying here that our healthcare system is better in general, some philosophical point of view than Canadian. I'm just saying that from an economic point of view, if you make something that is a real scarce good, and medical services are scarce good because the number of doctors and nurses and hospital beds and MRI machines and all other means of production that they use is limited. So we cannot satisfy every conceivable healthcare need in the community all in the same time. We have to ration. We have somehow to decide who gets the service. So in the system in which the price mechanism works, who pays gets the service. Pays directly out of pocket or through private medical insurance. In the system like the Canadian, you are prohibited from doing so. Now, what is the alternative? The demand will skyrocket. It will far exceed the capacity of healthcare system to deliver the services in a timely fashion. Wait lists. So there is one free market think tank in Canada called the Fraser Institute, and they compile the data in every Canadian province every year. What are the average wait lines for such and such medical procedure? It's for Americans, that's completely unacceptable wait lines. Sometimes for very serious medical conditions. Like the number of weeks that passes from you seeing a general physician, general practitioner, to seeing a specialist, could be 3 months, could be 4 months. It's mind-boggling when we compare it to American conditions. The only way to jump the queue, if it's really something that there is a reason that they believe it, it's something life-threatening. And even in that case, it's not 100%. So it's very cheap. It's extremely cheap, but that's not the same service that you get in the American system. In the American system, you pay much more, but you get something else. You get this plaque if you wait more than 10 minutes, alarm us, because that shouldn't be happening. So this is something that we have to bear in mind, that the demand has to be, it's impossible to have a shortage of anything in a free market system. You can have a situation in which some people cannot afford to buy something. The poor people cannot pay for a certain product or a certain service, but you cannot have a situation in which you want to buy something and you cannot find it. You want to buy something and you have enough money, you cannot buy it. Roads. Have you ever seen a congestion in a toll road? In America, the highways are free, but in Europe, with much higher density of population, actually you have the toll roads that function all the time. So I live, my parents live like 50 miles in Serbia in a small town, which is like 50 miles from the capital city, Belgrade. And how you drive from Mladenovac, my hometown, to Belgrade is actually you drive on a country road for 10 miles and then you enter the main highway, Belgrade-Niš, and then you pay like 10 euros or something for maybe 40 miles, 35 miles to reach Belgrade. So if you really want a fast drive, you have to pay for it. But you have an alternative road that goes over the mountains that you need. This road is 40 minutes. And you have an alternative road built in 1934 that will take you hour and a half to 40 minutes. But I like to drive sometimes because it's this kind of scenic road. But if you're really in a rush, you want to avoid that road. So imagine now that if there would have been any toll on this straight, quick highway, everybody would want to drive there. The allocation of traffic between the two roads would be wrong. But the only reason why the allocation of traffic would be wrong because the price of this superior good was not put. Now some people will shift. If you're really in a rush, you're gonna pay 10 euros to drive 40 miles on a straight highway. If you're not in a rush, you're gonna drive 2 hours on a narrow old road over the mountain of Alvala and so on. And now what's happening, because Serbia is a poor country and these toll duties are relatively high, many truck drivers are shifting from the highway to the old road, creating congestion on this road as well. So you see, in Europe, they regulated the traffic on their highways without any need for building new capacities or without the need to reduce artificially number of cars or trucks, just by putting a price on the services of a scarce resource. We have to realize that the highways are not, in spite of the fact that the government builds and maintains the roads, it's not a free good. If we artificially make it a free good on paper, we're going to create problems of overuse. The only way to prevent the overuse is to put a positive price on it, to make people pay for it. Okay, the third law of demand, Alchian and Allen. It has to do with relative prices as well. So what Alchian and Allen theorem, it is also reproduced in your book. By the way, for the first time, this theorem was formulated in an earlier version of this same textbook, published in 1956, I believe. It's called University Economics. That's one of the best-selling economics textbooks of all time. And it has to do with the relative prices of two goods that are sold in the same time. The example that they use is the first-class oranges and inferior oranges. So imagine now that you have two types of oranges, one type that is of higher quality and a lower quality oranges. They're produced in California. And they cost, the better oranges cost you $1, inferior oranges 50 cents. And now the theorem is that in New York, the ratio of high quality oranges will be higher. The ratio between high quality and low quality oranges will be higher in New York than in California. Out of the total quantity of oranges that are sold in New York, higher proportion of good oranges. There will be a higher proportion of good oranges than in California itself. So why is that the case? That's the case because of the transportation costs. How scarce something is determined by the relative prices. Relative prices are 1 to 2, 2 to 1 in California. So for every high class orange, you will have 2 lower quality oranges being sold. But what's going to happen if we assume that 50 cents of transportation costs from California to New York? What is the exchange ratio of relative prices of 2 types of oranges will be in New York? So you have 1 plus 0.5 equals 1.5. And 0.5, 50 cents, plus 50 cents transportation cost equals 1. So now what happened here? Instead of an exchange ratio 2 to 1, 1 to 0.5, in California, you have now the exchange ratio of 1.1 to 1 in New York. So now, in absolute terms, obviously, the oranges will be more expensive. Will be more expensive in New York than in California. If we assume that the preferences for oranges are the same, lower total quantity of oranges will be sold in New York than in California. If you assume that the income effect doesn't exist, that it is the same income and the same preferences for oranges vis-a-vis all other goods, okay? If you assume that, then the total quantity of oranges in New York will be lower than the total quantity of oranges in California because both good and bad oranges are more expensive. But, this is an important caveat, out of whatever quantity of oranges are sold on the market, a higher percentage of good oranges will be sold in New York, paradoxical. So see how paradoxical this is. These people in California produce oranges and they consume inferior product than people over there in New York who have to import the product. And the main reason for this is whenever you impose a fixed cost to any 2 products with different prices, a more high quality and more expensive good will be favored. Because instead of the exchange ratio of 2 to 1, now it's 1.5 to 1. If you import, whatever, 10 tons of oranges from California, it doesn't matter to you because the costs are the same for transporting both good and bad ones. It doesn't matter for you as a company which ones are you going to import, but you're motivated by price. You're going to earn more money by importing the good ones. So you will have this seeming paradox that in a country or in a local community, this is far away from the place where oranges are being grown, a higher ratio or higher percentage of good oranges will be spent. So any government measure or any economic fact that imposes the fixed costs on the production of these 2 goods will have the same effect. It will affect the exchange ratio between the 2 goods. So good oranges will become relatively less expensive in terms of bad oranges. You can impose, for example, tax. Imagine in California, actually, that you that you have the same costs of production. These would have been the same prices in California, 1 and 0.5. Let's say that somebody is so crazy as to impose tax on orange consumption. Somebody believes that oranges are bad for your health, and the government, that would surprise me from current California administration. I didn't say anything for you. But imagine that they did it, 50 cents per orange, you would have the same effect actually. The total consumption of oranges would have gone down, of both of these, but the consumption of bad oranges would have gone down further than the consumption of good ones, because the exchange ratio would change, and out of the total quantity, people would consume more good ones instead of bad ones. This is sometimes called the good oranges drive out bad oranges theorem by Auchian and Allen. So this is sometimes called the third law of demand. You can formulate it that any fixed cost imposed in the same time of two goods will favor the consumption of a more expensive good. So that's a general formulation. Any fixed cost imposed on the consumption of two goods of different prices will favor the consumption of more expensive good by reducing the relative price of more expensive good in terms of less expensive. That just if somebody artificially makes, wherever you have some other example, I'm struggling to come up with a more convenient example. It's good coffee or bad coffee.
Like cell phones and
Yeah, the two different types of cell phones made in China and sell some superior cell phones, and you increase by the same amount the price of both of them. The consumption of a superior one will increase relative to the consumption of an inferior one, because the exchange ratio will change in favor of a good one. Okay, finally, exceptions to the first law of demand. In just a few minutes, I will just mention one of these. There are 2 or 3 of them in your book. I just mentioned one. Exceptions, which means that people believe that there are some situations in which it seems like a higher price of a certain good leads to higher demand, which should be contradictory to the law of demand. There's an example of prestige goods. These are goods like Rolex watches or Ferrari cars or Versace dresses and so on. Stuff that people consume like crazy even when their prices go up. So now what is the problem with that? The problem with that is actually yeah, we're already out of time. Better, I don't have time for this. I don't have time for it. So just remember that we haven't had enough time to cover the exceptions to the law of demand. On Monday, I will begin with that. I will not include these in your homework assignment that is already opened. So just remind me to say something about the exceptions to the law of demand on Monday. I will continue with the theory of competition.
So what chapter should the?
Oh, this was chapter 9.
Yes.
5, 8, and 9.
Okay,
This week.
okay, so it's on this theory of demand pretty much.
Yeah,
Part.
demand,
Okay.
just demand.
Sounds good. Thank you.
No problem.